They say the forest remembers every promise ever made, even the ones people forget, and on certain mornings, if you're quiet enough to listen, it leaves behind signs meant only for those willing to follow. The first frost of November settled over the Bitterroot Mountains like a thin veil of silver, dusting the pines and cedar branches surrounding Ethan Calloway's cabin with a shimmer that caught the pale Montana sunrise. The air carried the clean scent of snow and damp earth, mixed with the faint aroma of wood smoke drifting from the iron stove inside. Ethan stepped onto the weathered porch with a steaming mug of black coffee warming his hands, his flannel jacket pulled tight against the sharp 30-degree chill. At 40 years old, he moved with the measured patience of a man who had spent too many years learning that rushing rarely changed outcomes. His broad shoulders still held traces of military discipline beneath worn layers of denim and wool, and faint silver threaded through his dark brown hair at the temples. A week's worth of stubble shadowed his square jaw, while his steel blue eyes scanned the tree line the same way they had once searched distant horizons overseas. Beside him, Ranger emerged from the cabin doorway with unusual hesitation. The 6-year-old German shepherd normally greeted mornings with quiet confidence, stretching beneath the porch light before trotting into the clearing to inspect the perimeter of the property. Today, he stopped midway across the porch. His ears stood rigid. His amber eyes remained fixed on the frost-covered ground ahead. Ethan noticed immediately. Ranger had saved lives during search and rescue deployments because he never ignored instinct, and neither had Ethan. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly, setting his coffee on the railing. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't growl. Instead, he slowly descended the porch steps and stood perfectly still near the edge of the clearing, his breath drifting into the cold morning air in white clouds. Ethan followed, boots crunching across frozen grass until he saw what had captured the dog's attention. A trail of footprints stretched across the clearing. They appeared overnight, pressed cleanly into the thin layer of frost, as though whoever made them had walked beneath the moonlight without disturbing anything else around them. Ethan crouched beside the nearest impression. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't ordinary boot prints either. The shape looked almost human but strangely elongated, too precise in spacing, too deliberate in direction. More unsettling than their appearance was their pattern. The tracks emerged from the forest beyond his property line and crossed directly toward the cabin before veering away toward the northern tree line. There were no signs of hesitation, no scattered disturbances, no return path, just one uninterrupted trail leading deeper into the woods. Ethan studied the surrounding clearing, searching for another explanation hidden among the frosted grass and silent pines. Nothing. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. Ranger stepped closer and lowered his nose toward the nearest print. Then he lifted his head and looked toward the distant forest with an expression Ethan had only seen a handful of times before. Not fear, not aggression, recognition. The dog's tail remained low as he turned back toward Ethan, meeting his gaze as though asking a question neither of them could fully understand. Then, without waiting for permission, Ranger began walking toward the trees, following the mysterious tracks with quiet certainty. Ethan glanced once over his shoulder at the cabin nestled beneath the pale dawn sky before tightening the collar of his jacket and falling into step behind his oldest friend, because sometimes the strangest journeys begin not with answers, but with the uneasy feeling that someone, or something, has already been waiting for you to arrive. Ranger moved through the forest with a focus that unsettled Ethan more than the strange impressions in the frost ever could. The German shepherd usually paused every few yards to inspect scents carried by the wind or investigate the restless movements of squirrels among the branches, but now he ignored everything except the path unfolding ahead. The morning sun climbed higher through the dense canopy, casting ribbons of pale gold between. Towering lodgepole pines while patches of untouched snow glimmered beneath the trees like scattered pieces of glass. Ethan adjusted the canvas strap of the small pack resting against his shoulder and matched the dog's steady pace, his boots sinking softly into damp layers of pine needles and earth hidden beneath the frost. The farther they traveled from the cabin, the quieter the world seemed to become. Even the usual chorus of mountain chickadees and distant crows had faded into an unnatural stillness that pressed gently against his thoughts. Ranger never once looked uncertain. Every few minutes, He slowed just enough to glance back over his shoulder, his amber eyes searching Ethan's face before continuing forward, as if confirming that they were still together in whatever invisible agreement had formed between them. Ethan had learned long ago that trust was built in moments exactly like these. During deployments overseas, there had been times when rangers sensed unstable ground, hidden hazards, or people trapped where no human voice could reach. The dog had never explained how he knew. He simply knew. The scent of cedar thickened as the forest deepened around them. Frost melted from branches overhead, sending occasional droplets to patter softly against Ethan's jacket sleeves. He noticed how Ranger's ears twitched toward sounds beyond human hearing, catching whispers hidden within the mountain breeze. Nearly an hour passed before the terrain shifted. The forest floor sloped gently downward, and the trees opened enough to reveal a narrow creek threading through smooth stones darkened by winter water. Thin ribbons of mist drifted above its surface, carrying the crisp scent of minerals and snowmelt. Ranger stopped near the bank. Ethan crouched beside him, unscrewing the cap from his canteen before offering the dog a drink. Ranger lapped quietly for a moment before lifting his head again. His gaze settled beyond the creek toward a distant rise covered in skeletal cottonwoods and aging fence posts leaning beneath decades of weather. Ethan followed the direction of that stare and frowned. He had lived near these mountains for nearly 3 years. He hunted there, trails, repaired neighboring fences for extra income, and knew the landmarks locals mentioned over coffee at the general store. Yet he had never noticed the remnants of fencing hidden among those trees. Ranger stepped into the shallow creek without hesitation, cold water rippling around his legs. Ethan exhaled slowly and followed. The icy current soaked through his boots, sending a sharp chill upward, but his attention remained fixed on the landscape beyond. As they climbed the opposite bank, the dog slowed for the first time since leaving the cabin. His tail remained low. His posture softened. There was no fear in him, only urgency wrapped inside recognition. The cottonwoods ahead swayed gently despite the absence of wind, their bare branches clicking together like old bones remembering forgotten songs. Ethan brushed moisture from his jeans and stared toward the rise where the fading tracks disappeared among the trees. He could not explain why the sight tightened something deep within his chest. Perhaps some places waited patiently for decades to be found. Or perhaps certain roads only revealed themselves when someone loyal enough refused to walk away. The rise beyond the cottonwoods revealed itself slowly, as though the mountain had decided that some truths should never be rushed into daylight. Ethan climbed the gentle slope with measured steps, his breathing visible in pale clouds that drifted into the crisp November air. Ranger remained several feet ahead, weaving between clusters of dormant sagebrush and weathered fence posts that leaned at odd angles beneath years of snow, rain, and forgotten seasons. Up close, the fencing no longer looked accidental. Rusted strands of wire stretched between cedar posts softened by age, marking boundaries that had once mattered deeply to someone. Ethan brushed his gloved hand against one of the posts and felt the rough grain beneath his fingertips. The wood had been cut by hand decades ago. Beyond the final stretch of fencing, the landscape opened unexpectedly. Nestled within a shallow valley stood the remnants of what had once been a small settlement. Time had reduced it to quiet outlines against the mountainside. Stone. Foundations peeked through brittle grass. A collapsed blacksmith shed leaned toward the earth as if exhausted from standing watch too long. The shell of a general store remained partially intact, its faded wooden porch sagging beneath years of winter storms. Ethan stopped moving altogether. He had never heard anyone mention a place like this. Locals at the diner in town loved sharing stories about hidden lakes, old mining claims, and ghost tales passed down through generations. Yet no one had spoken of an abandoned settlement hidden less than a few miles from his cabin. Ranger slowed near the center of the valley and lifted his nose toward the cold breeze. His ears twitched once, twice. Then he turned sharply toward the far end of the settlement. Ethan followed his gaze until he noticed the outline rising beyond the weathered buildings. A church. Its white paint had long ago surrendered to wind and snowfall, leaving behind gray boards silvered by time. The steeple still reached toward the pale blue sky, though part of its roof had collapsed inward. It stood alone at the edge of the valley like a guardian who had forgotten why it remained. Ranger began walking again. His pace was deliberate, each step carrying quiet purpose rather than curiosity. Ethan moved after him, boots pressing softly against patches of frost-covered grass. As they passed the old structures, details emerged from silence. A child's metal wagon lay overturned beside a porch. A cracked ceramic flower pot rested beneath a shattered window frame. Wind chimes fashioned from spoons and small horseshoes hung motionless outside what might have been a family home. There were no signs of panic or hurried departure. Instead, the settlement carried the melancholy of a place that had simply been left behind by time itself. Near the church entrance, Ranger stopped abruptly. He stood motionless before the weathered wooden steps, amber eyes fixed upon the closed front doors. Ethan listened carefully. At first, he heard only the distant rustling of cottonwood branches and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Then something softer reached him, a sound so faint he wondered whether memory itself had shaped it. Somewhere beneath the hush of the empty valley, a single church bell rang once. The tone drifted through the cold air with fragile sweetness before dissolving into silence. Ethan stared at Ranger. The German shepherd did not flinch. Instead, he lowered his head slightly and stepped toward the church doors as though responding to an invitation he had been expecting all along. The church doors resisted at first, their swollen wood protesting with a low groan that echoed softly through the empty valley before yielding beneath Ethan's steady push. A breath of cool, dust-laden air drifted outward carrying the scent of old timber, extinguished candles, and something sweeter beneath it all, as if traces of cedar incense still lingered after decades of silence. Ranger crossed the threshold without hesitation. His nails clicked gently against worn wooden floorboards that had been polished smooth by countless footsteps long before the settlement disappeared from memory. Ethan paused just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. Pale sunlight filtered through narrow stained glass windows lining the sanctuary walls, scattering muted colors across rows of weathered pews. Reds faded into rose. Blues softened into silver. The fractured images depicted scenes of mountains, rivers, and shepherds guiding flocks through valleys beneath open skies. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of light, like tiny floating stars suspended in stillness. Nothing about the church felt abandoned in the way the valley outside had. Instead, it carried the quiet dignity of a place that had waited patiently through every passing season. Ranger moved slowly down the center aisle. His ears remained upright, but his posture had softened. Ethan followed several steps behind, the floorboards sighing beneath his boots. Along the walls hung framed photographs protected beneath clouded glass. Families gathered on church steps after Sunday services. Children smiling proudly beside harvest baskets. Elderly couples seated beneath cottonwood trees. Ethan stopped briefly to study the faded faces. There was joy preserved in those images, ordinary moments that had once seemed too small to remember, yet had somehow survived the passage of time. Ranger halted near the altar. Sunlight spilled across the raised platform where a simple wooden cross remained mounted against the back wall. Wildflowers, long dried and brittle, rested inside a ceramic vase beside it. Ethan frowned. Someone had placed them there deliberately. He glanced around the sanctuary again. Dust covered most surfaces evenly, yet the area near the altar seemed strangely untouched. Ranger lowered his head and sniffed carefully before shifting toward the left side of the platform. A faint sound interrupted the silence. Ding! Ethan froze. The church bell rang once more. Not loud enough to startle, just clear enough to erase any doubt that he had imagined it before. The tone seemed to rise not from the steeple overhead, but from somewhere beneath the sanctuary itself. Ranger tilted his head, listening intently. Then he walked toward the far corner, near an old, upright piano draped beneath a faded white cloth. The dog circled twice before stopping. He placed one paw against the floorboards and looked directly at Ethan. The expression in those amber eyes carried a certainty that sent an unfamiliar chill across Ethan's shoulders. He approached slowly and knelt beside the German shepherd. Running his fingers across the wooden planks, he noticed subtle differences hidden beneath years of dust. Tiny scratches marked the seams. One section sat slightly lower than the surrounding boards, almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. Ethan pressed his palm against the wood and felt something unexpected. Not movement exactly, more like a distant vibration passing upward through the church floor. Soft, rhythmic, familiar. Ranger gave a quiet whine and rested beside him, never taking his eyes off the hidden section beneath their feet. Outside, the cottonwoods swayed beneath the pale afternoon sky, and somewhere beyond the mountains, winter prepared to settle deeper into the valleys below. Yet within the stillness of that forgotten sanctuary, Ethan understood with growing certainty that the journey had never been about finding an abandoned place. It had always been about uncovering what someone had worked very hard to leave behind for the right soul to discover. The vibration beneath Ethan's palm faded almost as quickly as he noticed it, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat and the lingering echo of the church bell that no longer rang. He remained kneeling beside Ranger for several moments, his fingers tracing the narrow seams between the floorboards while dust gathered against the sleeves of his jacket. The German shepherd watched him closely, amber eyes reflecting the fractured colors cast by stained glass overhead. Then, without warning, Ranger stood and walked toward the piano draped beneath the aging white cloth. Ethan followed slowly. The instrument rested in the corner beneath a layer of dust so thick it softened every edge, yet the bench before it appeared strangely undisturbed. Ranger lowered his nose to the wooden seat and inhaled deeply before nudging it with surprising gentleness. The bench shifted with a faint scrape against the floor. Ethan frowned. He gripped the edge and carefully pulled it aside. Beneath the piano bench, tucked between two floor supports, rested a small metal box no larger than a shoebox. Its once black paint had chipped away with age, exposing patches of dull steel beneath. A simple brass latch held it closed. There was no lock, no markings except for a single word written carefully on a strip of yellowed masking tape pressed across the lid. Wait. Ethan stared at the handwriting. The letters curved with patient precision, as though whoever had written them believed deeply in the importance of timing. Ranger sat beside him, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. The dog made no attempt to touch the box again. Ethan hesitated before lifting the latch. Inside, folded beneath layers of tissue paper brittle with age, rested a collection of carefully preserved items. There was a small leather-bound journal, its corners softened from use. A silver pocket watch stopped at exactly 11:23. Several black and white photographs secured with twine, and resting on top of everything else lay an envelope addressed in faded blue ink. To the one who followed. The sanctuary seemed to grow quieter as Ethan held the envelope in his hands. Outside, sunlight filtered through bare cottonwood branches, painting shifting patterns against the stained glass windows. He unfolded the letter carefully. The paper crackled softly beneath his fingers. The message was brief. If you are reading this, then the shepherd brought you here. Trust him. Some promises are stronger than time. Someone is still waiting below. Ethan read the words twice before lowering the page. His gaze drifted instinctively toward Ranger. The German shepherd remained perfectly calm, his ears relaxed, his eyes carrying the same quiet certainty that had guided them through the mountains all morning. Ethan glanced back toward the uneven section of floor near the altar. Below, the word lingered in his thoughts. He gathered the journal and photographs before studying the images spread across his lap. Families stood smiling outside the church steps decades earlier. Children held him books against wool coats. In one photograph, a young woman laughed beside a shepherd dog remarkably similar to Ranger, its alert ears and intelligent expression impossible to ignore. On the back of the photograph, written in the same careful handwriting, were 4 simple words. Eleanor Pierce. Christmas, 1974. Ranger rose to his feet before Ethan could fully process the discovery. The dog turned toward the altar once more and walked steadily across the sanctuary floor. When he reached the section of what Ethan had examined moments earlier, he stopped and placed one paw gently against it. Then he looked back over his shoulder, waiting with patient devotion for Ethan to understand that whatever had been hidden beneath the church had never been meant to stay lost forever. The church seemed to lean closer around them as Ethan approached the uneven section of floor once again, the faded colors from the stained glass windows shifting across the weathered planks like silent witnesses to a story that had waited generations to be heard. Ranger remained beside the hidden spot, his broad chest rising steadily with each breath, his amber eyes fixed not on Ethan, but on the wood beneath them. There was patience. In the dog's posture, a quiet confidence that had guided them from the cabin through frost-covered forests and forgotten valleys to this exact moment. Ethan set the photographs, journal, and letter carefully upon the nearest pew before kneeling once more. His fingertips explored the edges of the boards until they found what age and dust had concealed. A small iron ring rested flush against the floor, nearly invisible beneath layers of grime. He wrapped his gloved fingers around the cold metal and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan softened by time, a section of flooring lifted upward. Cool air drifted from the darkness below, carrying the scent of stone, cedar, and something unexpectedly familiar. Fresh bread. Ethan paused. It was impossible. Yet beneath the earth, hidden beneath a church abandoned for decades, lingered the comforting aroma of warmth and home. Ranger descended first. Narrow wooden steps spiraled downward into soft shadows illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns mounted along rough stone walls. Ethan followed carefully, each step creaking beneath his weight as the sanctuary above slowly disappeared from view. The underground passage opened into a chamber far larger than he had anticipated. Shelves lined the walls, neatly organized with preserved jars, folded blankets, books, and hand-labeled containers. A cast-iron stove radiated gentle warmth into the room. Hand-woven rugs softened the stone floor beneath sturdy wooden furniture polished by use rather than decoration. Nothing appeared neglected. The space felt lived in, loved. Ranger moved forward through the chamber with measured calm. Then he stopped. Seated beside the stove in a rocking chair, wrapped in a knitted cream shawl, was an elderly woman. Silver hair fell in a loose braid over one shoulder. Her lined hands rested quietly upon her lap. Pale blue eyes lifted toward Ethan with an expression that held neither surprise nor fear. Instead, they reflected the peaceful relief of someone whose waiting had finally ended. "You took your time," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of old hymns and winter kitchens. Ethan stood motionless. "My name is Ethan," he replied after a long silence. The woman smiled gently. "I know." Her gaze shifted toward Ranger. Tears brightened her eyes almost immediately. "And there you are," she whispered. Ranger crossed the room and lowered himself beside her chair. She reached trembling fingers toward the German shepherd's head, brushing the fur between his ears with remarkable familiarity. "Good boy," she murmured. "You came back." Ethan struggled to find words that made sense of the impossible scene before him. "You know Ranger?" Eleanor Pierce looked toward the photographs resting in his hands. Her smile deepened, touched by memories older than grief. "I knew another shepherd many years ago," she said. "He belonged to a young veteran who promised he would return after helping this valley through its darkest season." She glanced back down at Ranger, who leaned gently against her knee. "He never made it back," she continued softly. "But before he left, he told me something I never forgot. He said that sometimes God sends the same kind of soul twice when a promise is too important to leave unfinished." The fire crackled quietly in the stove as snow clouds gathered beyond the hidden world beneath the church, and Ethan realized that some mysteries were never meant to be solved by reason alone. Some were meant to heal what time itself had been unable to mend. The warmth of the hidden chamber wrapped itself around Ethan like a memory he could not quite place, easing the chill that had settled deep within his bones during the long walk through the mountains. Snow had begun to fall somewhere above them, and although he could no longer hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside, he imagined soft white flakes drifting across the forgotten valley while time continued its quiet work beyond the stone walls. Eleanor Pierce reached toward the cast-iron kettle resting atop the stove and poured steaming tea into mismatched ceramic cups painted with tiny blue wildflowers. Her hands trembled slightly with age but never lost their purpose. Ranger remained at her side, his head resting gently against her knee while she occasionally brushed her fingers through the thick fur around his neck. Ethan accepted the tea she offered and settled into the worn wooden chair opposite her. The room carried the comforting scent of cedar shelves, baking bread, and lavender tucked into linen sachets hanging near the hearth. Nothing about the underground sanctuary resembled survival born from fear. Instead, it felt like a place built from devotion, preserved through hope, and sustained by quiet acts of faith repeated over many years. Eleanor studied Ethan over the rim of her cup with thoughtful blue eyes that had witnessed both sorrow and grace. "The young man who came before you was named Thomas Whitaker," she said softly. "He arrived after the winter of 1974 with a shepherd named Boone. The valley had nearly emptied by then. Families moved away. Businesses closed. The church bells stopped ringing. But Thomas believed that abandoned places still deserved kindness." Ethan listened without interruption. Ranger lifted his head slightly at the mention of the other shepherd's name before settling once again beside Eleanor's chair. "Thomas repaired broken roofs," Eleanor continued. "He carried firewood to widows who could no longer split it themselves. He fixed fences for farmers who could not afford help. He never asked for payment." A smile touched the corners of her mouth. He said serving others had taught him that dignity was not measured by what people owned, but by what they chose to give away. Eleanor reached toward a nearby cabinet and retrieved a leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon. She placed it carefully upon the table between them. Inside rested dozens of letters bundled together with twine, photographs, hand-drawn maps, newspaper clippings yellowed by time. There were records of food deliveries made during harsh winters, lists of names beside handwritten notes describing illnesses, births, graduations, and hardships overcome through the support of neighbors who refused to let one another struggle alone. Ethan turned each page slowly. What unfolded before him was not the story of hidden wealth. It was the story of a community stitched together through compassion. Thomas planned to return after helping establish a veterans outreach program in neighboring towns, Eleanor said quietly. Before he left, he entrusted Boone with one final promise. If circumstances changed and he could not return, someone else would eventually come. Someone who understood loss without surrendering kindness. Tears glistened briefly in her eyes before she smiled again. For 50 years, I wondered whether that promise had simply become another beautiful story people tell themselves to make waiting easier. Ranger rose to his feet then and walked toward the far wall of the sanctuary. Beneath shelves lined with preserved jars and folded quilts stood an old cedar cabinet Ethan had barely noticed before. The German shepherd stopped beside it and looked back expectantly. Eleanor's expression softened into something close to wonder. "No," she whispered, pressing trembling fingers against her lips. "It cannot be." Yet Ranger placed one steady paw against the cabinet door exactly as Boone had apparently done half a century earlier. And in the gentle crackle of the stove fire and the hush of falling snow overhead, Ethan understood that promises built from love often traveled farther through time than anyone dared imagine. The cedar cabinet opened with surprising ease, its hinges releasing a soft sigh that blended with the crackling fire and the distant murmur of winter settling over the mountains above. Ethan stepped closer while Ranger stood patiently beside the weathered wood, his tail swaying once against the stone floor before becoming still again. Eleanor remained seated near the stove, one trembling hand pressed lightly against her heart, as though steadying emotions she had carried for half a century. Inside the cabinet rested neither gold nor precious heirlooms in the ordinary sense. Instead, shelves carefully protected by linen cloth held journals filled with names, folded letters tied with ribbon, framed photographs, and dozens of neatly organized files arranged with deliberate care. At the center sat a polished steel lockbox engraved with a simple image of a shepherd standing beneath a pine tree. Ranger lowered his head toward it before looking back at Ethan with the same unwavering certainty that had guided every step of this impossible journey. Ethan knelt and lifted the lid. Inside lay a leather folder containing legal documents preserved in protective sleeves, along with a final handwritten letter bearing Thomas Whitaker's unmistakable signature. Ethan unfolded the pages carefully. The script was strong and measured, written by someone who understood the value of choosing each word with intention. Thomas explained that after witnessing too many veterans return home carrying invisible burdens, he had worked alongside members of the Valley community to establish a sanctuary where former service members could find shelter, purpose, and belonging. Local families had donated land, resources, and labor. Farmers had pledged seasonal harvests. Teachers volunteered their time. Craftsmen offered training. The abandoned settlement above had been transformed into a dream rooted not in charity, but dignity. Then life had redirected Thomas elsewhere before the project could be completed. Knowing uncertainty often accompanies even the best intentions, he entrusted Eleanor with preserving everything until the right person arrived. The accompanying documents revealed that the surrounding acreage, church property, and restored buildings had been placed into a trust created specifically to serve veterans struggling to rebuild their lives. The trustees named within the papers had long since passed away. Only one line remained blank beneath the final section, awaiting a steward willing to continue what others had begun. Eleanor's voice trembled with quiet wonder. "I thought the dream had ended with all of us growing older," she admitted softly. "I never imagined someone would come carrying the same spirit." Ethan looked down at the papers resting in his hands. He had spent years drifting through seasons measured by survival rather than hope. Since returning home, he had repaired fences, rebuilt cabins, and convinced himself that solitude was safer than risking disappointment. Yet as he studied the names recorded throughout the files, he saw evidence of ordinary people choosing compassion repeatedly despite hardship. Ranger rested his head gently against Ethan's shoulder. Warmth spread through Ethan's chest unlike anything he had felt in years. Outside, snow continued falling over forgotten rooftops and weathered church steps. Inside the sanctuary beneath the earth, Eleanor reached toward a faded photograph showing Thomas standing beside Boone while smiling children gathered around them. "Miracles rarely arrive the way people expect," she whispered. "Sometimes they come disguised as second chances. Sometimes they arrive with muddy boots and faithful companions." Ethan glanced toward Ranger, whose amber eyes reflected both devotion and peace. For the first time since following mysterious tracks away from his cabin, he understood that he had not been led toward a hidden treasure waiting to change his life. He had been guided toward a purpose waiting patiently for him to remember who he had always been. Winter loosened its grip on the mountains one day at a time, surrendering frost to rain and eventually to the tender green promise of spring, and in the months that followed, the forgotten valley slowly awakened from its long silence. Ethan returned to his cabin only long enough to gather what little he owned before making the old church and the hidden sanctuary beneath it the center of a new life he had never expected to claim. Together with Eleanor, he cleaned dust from the abandoned buildings above, repaired broken windows, reinforced sagging porches, and restored the dignity of places that had once sheltered families, laughter, and hope. Ranger remained close through it all, moving from room to room with calm devotion, as though inspecting work that had begun long before either of them arrived. Word traveled quietly through neighboring towns. It came through conversations shared over diner counters and church potlucks, through veterans organizations and community bulletin boards, through ordinary people who still believed that kindness deserved company. Retired carpenters offered their skills. Gardeners planted vegetables in reclaimed soil behind the old general store. Teachers donated books to fill shelves inside the restored church hall. A local baker arrived each Saturday morning carrying fresh loaves wrapped in linen cloth, their warmth filling the valley with the scent of cinnamon and yeast. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through open windows and children from nearby towns chased one another across the churchyard, while volunteers painted weathered fences white once again, Ethan found himself standing beside the old cottonwoods at the edge of the settlement. Ranger settled at his feet, his silver and cream coat glowing beneath the spring sun. Beyond them, veterans sat on porches sharing stories they had hidden for years. Some spoke easily, others simply listened. No one was rushed. No one was forgotten. Eleanor joined him slowly, leaning upon a polished cedar cane carved by one of the men who had recently found refuge in the valley. Her blue eyes reflected the life unfolding around them. "Thomas would have loved this," she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the church steeple rising against the Montana sky. "I think he knew," he replied. "Maybe not how it would happen, but I think he believed someone would eventually finish what he started." Eleanor smiled and rested her hand briefly upon his arm. "The world remembers more goodness than people realize," she whispered. "Sometimes it simply waits for the right moment to return it." Later that evening, after the last rays of sunlight had turned the mountains gold and the valley settled into peaceful quiet, Ethan walked alone toward the church steps. Ranger followed beside him as faithfully as ever. The old photographs, letters, and journals now rested safely inside the sanctuary, preserved not as relics of sorrow, but as reminders that ordinary compassion possesses extraordinary endurance. Ethan paused at the top of the steps and looked back across the valley. Lanterns glowed warmly inside restored windows. Laughter drifted through the cooling air. Somewhere nearby, someone strummed a guitar softly while another voice joined in song. Ranger sat beside him and leaned gently against his leg. Ethan reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears before lifting his gaze toward the distant tree line beyond the cottonwoods. The mysterious tracks that had first appeared outside his cabin had long since vanished beneath winter snow and spring rain. He never discovered who made them or how they arrived. In the end, he no longer needed to understand. Some mysteries exist, not to be solved, but to guide us toward the people we are meant to become. Beneath the fading light of another Montana sunset, surrounded by a community rebuilt through faith, service, and quiet perseverance, Ethan finally understood that miracles rarely announce themselves with thunder. More often, they arrive as loyal companions, forgotten promises, and the courage to follow where love gently leads.